Now, can you hear me all? Please raise your hands if you can hear me. Now I'll continue with the teaching. Now we've been talking about the Indus Valley civilization. Achieved a high, and how it achieved a high level of development. And so how do we, what level of development did it reach? To speak about it in English, we say it had like a social classes. There were probably some sort of a leader, perhaps a king, or then below that there were military figures. So we talk about ranks of nobility. So there's probably some sort of a level of classes. And so it had achieved the society achieved a great level of social development. And this Indus Valley civilization is probably the first form of a state or first form of a country in there. And in order to have a state, you have to have a city. And not only was there one city, there were 5 or 6 different ruins of cities. And so it is probably the first time that states had developed in India. However, the details of the society and the states cannot be described accurately, and the reason is because we've found a few artifacts from underground, but other than that, we haven't got any manuscripts or any other information. Prior to the artifacts being unearthed, no one knew at all that there was any Indus Valley civilization. It was not recorded in history, and no one knew anything about it. So it was only after the artifacts had been unearthed that the people realized, oh, in the past there was this sort of a civilization. Not only was there civilization, it also had a very high level of development. Only then could they infer these facts. So in the end, this Indus Valley civilization disappeared very quickly. It disappeared. And the reason why it disappeared is, and so what some scholars say is that prior to that, the Indus Valley civilization so some scholars say that it was because of the Aryan invasions of India that the Harappan civilization disappeared, and it's because of their arrival that the Indus Valley civilization disappeared. And there have been some scholars who have held those positions. However, currently, as archaeologists examine the regions where Indus Valley civilization artifacts have been found, and there are many ruins and many different sites, and as they examine all of these, they can see that there's no evidence for the postulate of earlier scholars that the Indus Valley civilization disappeared upon the arrival of the Aryans. And the reason why they can say this is that the arrival of the Aryans in India is several hundred years after the disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization. Only a few hundred years after it disappeared did the Aryan peoples arise. At the time that the Indus Valley civilization was flourishing, the Aryan people had not arrived. So, for this reason, we can say that the idea that the Indus Valley civilization disappeared on the arrival of the Aryans is not accurate. The second thing is that if the Aryans had, if the Indus Valley civilization had disappeared on the arrival of the Aryas, then at that time there would have to been armed conflict, a war between the two. But when we look at the artifacts between the two, we don't see any signs of there having been a war, in particular of any conflict with the Aryan people. And so, for this reason, they say that there is no evidence or source for the earlier idea that it had been the arrival of the Aryan peoples that destroyed the Indus Valley civilization. In any case, the fully developed civilization, how long did it remain? It probably lasted for over 600 years. And after remaining for about 600 years, then it declined. And the time that decline happened is probably about 1750 years BC. Now, if we wonder what is the cause or the condition that caused that civilization to actually decline and disappear, these days the researchers and scientists are not able to describe it. Now, people have different opinions. Say maybe it's this, maybe it's that. There's a lot of guesswork, but there's no definitive answer. Now, some people say is that the cities were destroyed, and the trade therefore also then ceased. And they also, prior to that, had many different crafts, pottery, making stone figures. They had many different craft works, and those also declined. And the people who inhabited the cities had to spread to many different areas. And then gradually, the civilization underwent a great decline and eventually disappeared. Now, there was one area called Lotar. I'm not sure that's the Chinese word, but I'm not sure what it's called in English, maybe Lotar. So in that one area of Lotar, then the civilization or the culture was able to remain in this area of Lotar. And so it's able to list a little bit longer in there, but in all the other areas, the civilization declined quickly. Now, the reason why it declined so quickly is that what many scholars say is that it's primarily changes in the climate. The weather changed, the climate changed, and because of that, the civilization declined, they say. And the reason they say this is because when they look at the reminds, they see the signs that there had been floods and other destruction. So it seems that at one time there was a great environmental destruction or disaster, and many people left. Now, it's quite possible that a few remained, but most people had to flee, and because of that, it probably declined. Or alternatively, there might have been a great famine and there was nothing to eat. And so for that, and many people died at one time and it declined. Or perhaps there was some sort of other event that occurred that meant that the people would no longer be able to remain in the location, and so they had to flee to other locations. And so that could be another reason for its design. Well, perhaps there was a great drought, and then the crops failed, or something like that. But the main thing they're saying is that it's probably because of changes in the climate or changes in the weather that this civilization had to decline. And so that's the main reason that people think. And what some scholars say is that And it's possible there was a natural disaster. And then in addition to that, that there might have been invaders from abroad, and it's probably because of that that it divided. But who the external peoples would have been, no one can say. In any case, it's impossible that there was a natural disaster, and impossible that in addition to that, there was an invasion. And because of that, there's probably the civilization probably declined. And so that's one of many different postulates, hypotheses. But it just seems that in this area there was a natural disaster, and many people died, and that caused hardship and difficulties. No, in any case, in the end, the Indus Valley civilization did disappear. Though it disappeared, even though it declined, it still had a great influence on the further developments of Indian civilization. As I've already said before, the Indus Valley civilization had reached a very high level. And because it was so highly developed, the people who were there were able to keep many of the most important developments that happened. Now, most of the elements of the civilization declined, but there is a city making the very, but there is no independent or autonomous independent Indus Valley civilization, but many aspects of its civilization continued. For example, there are the agriculture, the different types of crops they planted, the way the culture of raising livestock, or the technology of livestock, their weaving, and also their craftsmanship. And so these crafts and weaving and so forth were all continued. Similarly, as I explained before, as I mentioned, there was a religious tradition of worshiping gods, and particularly of worshiping goddesses, as I mentioned. And so at that time, they worshipped goddesses, and there was a tradition of worshiping the god Indra, as I mentioned before. And so that tradition later also continued in the Brahmanic tradition and was maintained in that tradition. And so for that reason, even though the Indus Valley civilization declined and disappeared, it was not able to continue as an independent entity, but many elements of its culture were then incorporated into the overall culture of India. And so the development of Indian culture, the Indus Valley civilization had a very strong impact, a high influence. Now, as I mentioned before, the Indus Valley civilization had two stages. The first part was the Indus Valley civilization itself. And then the second part was the post-Indus Valley civilization. And the post-Indus Valley civilization was the period after the Indus Valley civilization had declined and a new culture developed. Now, it was not as highly developed as the Indus Valley civilization. So what happened is that at that time, They're trying to repeat what had happened in the previous era. And so the Indus Valley civilization was it was a time when they used both stone tools and bronze tools. But in the post-Indus Valley civilization, the culture that happened in the areas of the Indus Valley civilization did not have that technological advances. They did not know how to use metal tools, or they were unable to use metal tools. And so this is a new culture that arrived. They had reverted to the Neolithic technology. And so that new culture was not a primarily urban civilization, right? The Indus Valley civilization was a very highly developed and elaborate urban civilization. And after the Indus Valley civilization declined, then the new culture was a village culture. And the tools were stone tools. And so it's like they had returned to reverted back to the Neolithic age. And so that is kind of the form that they have. And what we call that is, as I mentioned before, is called the post-Indus Valley civilization. And so that's the name we call it by. And the time that this culture occurred was from around 1500 BC. Now that culture, between that culture and the Indus Valley civilization, was there a connection? Of course there was a connection. But the people who started this new culture, who probably, where did they come from? There were probably people who came to, it's probably people who were from northwest India who came and who revived it. Or it could have been Aryan peoples who had already arrived, and they then began this new culture. In any case, these are some of the hypotheses. But the main thing is what I'm saying here. I'm talking about North India. I'm talking about the development of civilization and culture in North India. However, India is a huge country. In the South India and the East India, what sort of a civilization and culture did they develop? Their cultures were probably primarily in the Neolithic technology. So from the Neolithic age, they gradually developed. And they also, in the east of India and South India, they also developed their own independent civilizations that had no contact with the other civilizations, in particular, no connections with those connections in North India, especially the Indus Valley civilization I just mentioned. And so they developed their own independent civilizations in their own regions, it seems. And so at that time, in all the areas of India, the east, west, south, and north, there are many different new cultures that developed. And all of these cultures were all founded by people of different ethnic groups. They had different origins. And all these cultures reached many different levels of development. It's not like they're all a single culture with a single origin with the same level of technology. However, as I said before, the Indus Valley civilization probably had a great influence on all of these different cultures. And it seems that for this reason, they're somewhere able to continue some elements of the Indus Valley civilization, as I mentioned before. But the Indus Valley civilization and the cultures that developed later in other areas, the biggest difference between them is that the Indus Valley civilization reached a very high level of development. It became an urban civilization. The cultures in the other regions were either village cultures, and so it seemed like they were a little bit less developed cultures. So that's that. So that's the first period, or the first era, the period of the Indus Valley civilization. So now we've come to the second period. Now, the second period is very important. Now, the second era is the Vedic period. The Vedic period Now, the second period. Now, this also has two different periods. There's the early Vedic period, or another area that's called can also be called the Punjab period. The reason why it would be called the Punjab period, I will explain later. Now, the dates of that period, it's like from the 15th century BC to the 11th century BC. The second is the late Vedic period. And this is also called the period of the development of philosophy. And this is from the 11th to the 6th century BC. Now, after the Indus Valley civilization developed, there was a new culture that appeared, as I mentioned. Now, so a little bit mistake. So after the Indus Valley civilization finished, a new culture developed, and that's what we call the Vedic period, or the Vedic age, the Vedic culture. Now, at that time, there's a great improvement in the way people thought, and the reason what happened, because many different philosophies and styles of thought arose. So at that time, so we describe it as two, as I mentioned before. As I meant before, there's the early Vedic period and the later Vedic period. These two. Now, before we speak about the Vedic period, we need to understand who the people who established it are, the Aryan people who established and who developed this civilization. And before we talk about the Aryan peoples, we first have to look at a map. Now, what this map shows us is, as I said before, the Aryan peoples, where did they come from? They came from outside of India, from other places. They came from other areas and migrated into India. And when they arrived was after the disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization, some 200 or 300 years after that. That's when they first arrived. And their arrival in India was through the path, as I mentioned before. In the ancient times, the primary way into India was the northwest of India, where there are several different paths, and so they came through these before arriving in India. They arrived gradually. It was in stages. It was not many people all at once. Those came in different groups and arrived in India. They arrived in India, and then they settled in India. So these Aryan peoples, so of the present-day population of India, a large percentage come from the Aryan peoples. Their ancestors are the Aryans. And the Aryans comes from the word Arya. Now, this is the word that means pakpa. I mean, it's like we talk about noble individuals and ordinary individuals. This means that Arya, that means the nobles and noble individuals. So that word Arya, it comes from the original from the Aryan language. And the meaning of Arya is superior. That's as we say it in Tibetan, it's pakspa. It means superior. And where this name comes from, it comes from the texts of the Vedas. And when they're saying Arya, is that the Aryan people, when they call this, they say, I'm Aryan. They say that Tibetans would say, I'm Tibetan, right? And similarly, the Aryan people would say, I'm Aryan. And so this is the name that the people gave themselves, saying, I'm superior. I'm from a good clan. I'm from a good family. I'm a superior person. Now, some scholars say that actually the meaning of the word Arya is to obey or to have faith, to worship, and explained as having this sort of a meaning. And the reason they say this is that the Aryan people consider themselves as being very faithful and religious people, saying, I have faith, I have devotion for the gods. And so when the Aryans arrived in India, there were people who did not have faith in the gods, who did not worship the gods. And in order to understand that, they could say, I'm someone who believes in the gods, and called themselves by that name. And so this is a position of some scholars. Now, another important point, as we've been describing before, is that some European scholars in the past, I didn't explain this before, I'm sorry. In the past, some European scholars said that Aryan is the name of an ethnic group. There's an Aryan mythic group. Like if we say you're Tibetan, you're a Tibetan. There's a Tibetan ethnic group. If you're saying Chinese, there's a Chinese ethnic group. And similarly, there's an Aryan ethnic group. And they identify as that. However, later, or that Arya is a race. And so later scholars looked at it and said there's actually no Aryan race. Actually, within the Aryan peoples, there are many different people of different ethnic groups. It's not a single ethnic group or a single race. And so for this reason, we say about Aryan is not all the same race or the same ethnic group. It's not okay to identify it as a single race. But the main point of the reason why they're called Aryans is because they're the same language. Even if they aren't the same ethnic group, they can have they have the same language. And so this Aryan language is one of the Indo-European languages. And so this is called an Indo-European European language. And the reason we can know this is something you will, I think, understand as I explain this gradually. The Aryan people came first. They came from these Central Asian regions. And so they lived in a region of Central Asia. So it's that yellow area, it's in that yellow oval in the center. And so they originally lived in this region of Central Asia. And they were primarily nomadic peoples. And then probably around 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, they divided into two groups. One of these went to present-day Europe. And so one group went to Europe, and as they went to the European continent, and so nowadays, the ancestors of most present-day Europeans are these Aryan peoples. Now, another group where they went to the east. And those who went to the east came to the Hindu Kush mountain range. They crossed this mountain range and came to the area of Kabul in present-day Afghanistan. And when they passed through that region, and so they followed the areas of the Harabi River in Afghanistan, and also came to the area of there's one of the rivers called the Sangirvis in the area of Punjab. And so there are these two rivers, one in Afghanistan and one in India. And so they came into the same areas and they settled in this region. And that region that they settled in, the people from there then again divided into two groups. One of these groups went from the west down to the south. They left from India, they went toward the direction of the Arab countries. And so they arrived in Persia, the present-day Iran. And when they arrived there, they developed the Persian civilization. So they were the ones who founded the Persian civilizations. And the remaining people continued to down to the southeast into India. And where they arrived in India was in the region of Punjab. They arrived in the region of Punjab and they settled there. And for this reason, those who arrived in the region of Punjab are called the Indo-Aryan Peoples. So first, the Aryan peoples there, for their initial origin is from Central Asia. Some of them went to Europe, some went to Iran, and some came to India. But the first were all lived together, and that because they all together, they all had the same language. And those people, the one language, the same language, all went to different languages. Some went to Europe, some went to India, and some went to Persia. And so their mother language, or the mother of all their languages, is the same. And so for that reason, as I said, the Sanskrit language and the Western European languages, for example, Latin, come from the same mother. And that's the reason why we say this. And the reason is that they first all lived in the same region. And they're an ethnic group that all lived in the same region. There's a society that lived together. But when they spoke to each other, they had to be able to understand each other. And so in order to understand each other, they have to use one language. But in the end, they all went to different places. But originally, they had the same language. But because there was such a long passage of time that their languages diverged and became different. So graphically, they're the ones who went to Europe, and those who went to Iran, we don't need to speak about them. Now, Now, the ones we need to speak about now are the Aryans who came to India and settled in the region of Punjab. Now, the region of Punjab, the reason why it's called Punjab is that the word Punjab is that the Indus River has many different tributaries. And those tributaries, the five greatest tributaries, are there five rivers. And so among the many different tributaries, there are five major tributaries or five major rivers that flow into it. And so because of those five rivers, it's called Punjab. The name Punjab is actually in Persian. Panj means five. Ab means river. And you put the two together, you get Punjab. So it means the five rivers. And the reason is they live in the basin of five rivers, and so it's called the five rivers or Punjab. Now, in Sanskrit, it's called the Panchnada, or five rivers. Now, the reason it's talked about the five rivers, but actually, now, of course, there are many different. It's sometimes talked about as seven rivers, but actually, the seven is like all tributaries of the five, and so for that reason, Punjab is called the region of the five rivers. So the Aryan people arrived in India newly, but before they came to India, there were indigenous Indian peoples who had lived in that area. There was that ethnic group that lived there, and that ethnic group was primarily a Dravidian group. But the Dravidian peoples, the Aryans really looked down on the Dravidian peoples. They would say, we're Aryans, we're superior, and you are a lower class or a lower type of people. You are inferior people. You don't have a lot of education. And so they thought of them as in that fashion. And so because of that, what should I say? When the Arya peoples arrived in India initially, they seized the area of Punjab. And when they seized that area, they came and they had some sort of a battle or conflict with the indigenous inhabitants. And in the battles, so there's a great war between them. And at that time, the Aryan people called the people of the original indigenous inhabitants, they called them Dasa, which means either enemy, like opponents. That means like the enemies that you're fighting against. And the Arya people would, the opponents of the Aryas were people with who were darkened skin. And when they spoke, and people who spoke in a way that was, their language was coarse, and their noses were flat, and they didn't conduct sacrifices and so forth. They didn't consider sacrifices important, and so for that reason, many scholars, when they research and hypothesize about this, they say that the people that they call the enemies were probably Dravidian peoples. They say they infer that it's the Dravidian peoples were the enemies. If we compare it with the Dravidian people, the Aryan peoples were tall people. They were tall. They knew how to ride horses. And not only did they ride horses, they also had carts and chariots. And because they could ride chariots and as they fought in battle. Now, the Dravidian people, in terms of their so the Aryan people had superior weaponry and superior tactics to the people who lived in that area, so that they very easily subdued all the peoples who lived, the indigenous people who lived in that area. And after they did so, those people, the indigenous inhabitants had lost, and so the Aryan people then made them to slaves. And so the Aryan peoples then were the people who were in charge, and the indigenous people from that area, since they had lost, became slaves and peasants. So this is how it's explained that it happens. As the Aryan peoples then settled in Punjab, after a certain amount of time, and then the population grew. As the population grew, they thought to themselves that some of them thought that they went to a different, to move to different regions. So from about the 12th century to the 9th century, the Aryan people had to move. And so they went to the areas of the Ganges River. And so they invaded the Ganges River Valley. And they also fought against the people, the original inhabitants of the Ganges River Valley. And in the end, the inhabitants of the valley just lost. And then not only that, the Arya people, how shall I say this? They formed states, or it became like the source or the hub of the development of their civilization. And not only that, the Aryan peoples, from one perspective, when they arrived in the region first arrived in a region and they fought the people in that region, they took power. They subdued all the people in those regions. In another area, when they arrived at a new area, they also borrowed the best from the original culture and the original inhabitants of those areas. They took those best areas and they combined them with their own culture and civilization, and integrated them into their own culture. And so for that reason, as I mentioned before, there's the Japanese scholar I mentioned before, right? Yuke Mitsunaga. And this Japanese scholar himself actually was a Japanese bhikshu or monk, and he's one who conducted a lot of research into the topic of the secret mantra. And what he says about this is the Aryan peoples arrived in the Ganges River Valley, and while developing their civilization in the Ganges area, they incorporated elements of the original inhabitants of the Ganges River, and so these two mixed. There's a great connection happening in between the Aryans and the people and the original inhabitants of the Ganges, and so later, a new culture that had elements of both of these cultures then also developed, and there are many signs of this. Not only do we see this in Indian cultures, not only do we see signs of this in Indian culture in general, we see this in our secret mantra Vajrana, that we have the combination of the different cultures. One sign of this is that, for example, in the secret mantra, we have the different we have the wrathful deities, and so the wrathful deities are not an Aryan deities. Now, whose culture? They're not an Aryan culture. They're actually, these wrathful deities came from the Dravidian peoples. So when we talk about if we look for the origin of the wrathful deities, if it comes from the Dravidian culture, and so it arises from the Dravidian culture, and later in the Gupta culture, then only at that point was the talk about the five great wrathful deities and so forth, was during the only started spreading in the Vajrayana in the 5th century. Now, among the five great festivities, we have like Vajrayaksha. So Vajrayakshini. It's like we talked about how in the Indus Valley civilization there was a lot of goddess worship, and so within Indus Valley, the goddess that they worshipped in the Indus Valley civilization was very similar to Vajrayakshini, and so we can say that there's a great relation between the Indus Valley civilization goddess and the Vajrayakshini. Likewise, we also talk about Panashavari, right, as well as the great king Vaishravana. These are also not from Arya culture. There's no discussion of this of Vaishravana or Panashavari in the Aryan culture. These originated from other cultures. Similarly, within the secret mantra, we talk about the great Piha, great Mayuri. The great Mayura, Mahamayura. And this word comes from the Munda language, the Munda peoples. And in the Munda language, there's a word called Mora. And so the name of Mayura came from this word Mora, it's the great period. So it is not related to the original Aryan people. Likewise, in the secret mantra, we talk about the gods and the Nagas and the Yakshas and the Rakshas and so forth. This is in the secret mantra. It's not just in the secret mantra, it's also in the Mahayana too. And it's also mentioned in the foundation vehicle teachings too, in the Theravada teachings. And so the Aryan people, there's no mention of the Nagas in the Aryan culture, but in India, there were the cobras, right? The cobra snakes. They considered cobras to be very important. They became Nagas. And so they considered cobras to be like snakes, and they made offerings to them. And so so in the past, there was a culture that worshipped snakes in this way. And so they called this language called the Naga was a name for snakes as for cobras. And so that's why they talk about Nagas. So we talk about the culture about Nagas is also from another Indian, non-Aryan Indian culture. Also particular of the secret mantra is that we have talked about have wrathful deities who eat human flesh. And many wrathful deities wear necklaces and bracelets worn of snakes, or necklaces of human heads, and there's these appearances, right? And where this comes from is from the Dravidian peoples. the goddesses that the Dravidian people wore that sort of those sorts of accoutrements, like the snake roots, the necklaces of human skulls, and so there are such goddesses in the Dravidian cultures. So when we talk about wrathful deities in the Vajrayana, these all come from the Dravidian culture, and then were gradually incorporated into the secret mantra. So later, when we think about the human, when we think about the goddesses, the female goddesses, we can see the influence of the Dravidian people. And so their culture is like the basis for the different for the different ornaments and so forth that are worn by the wrathful female deities. And so basically, and within our secret mantra, we don't only have male gods, we also have female goddesses. There are many aspects that are related to goddesses. And so when we talk about the female gods, are not particularly related to the Aryan culture. They primarily come from other different types of peoples. But later, the Aryan people then incorporated the elements of other cultures into their people, into their own culture. And later, the Aryan people also began to worship goddesses and so forth. So it seems that initially they did not particularly worship goddesses. So in brief, so we can see that there's been a lot of influence of non-Aryan cultures on the secret mantra. And still, even within there, quite a bit. There are also many other aspects and things that we do not know about also for what we need to understand now. In order to know this, we have to need to understand. We need to have great in the social sciences and various in archaeology and so forth. And only when we have great improvement in that, only then will we be able to understand how we have so many different forms of goddesses, the many different types of ornaments and clothing that they wore. So all these are related to many of different cultures of India. There's from the Aryan culture, the Dravidian culture, the Munduk culture. And so many of these cultures, many different cultures had relations. And because of this, in the secret mantra of Vajrayana, we have the many different male and female gods and goddesses and the different robes and ornaments and accoutrements that they wore. And so the secret mantra of Vajrayana combines the elements of many different cultures. And if to say this, there's nothing wrong with saying that. So for that reason, it's not that we as religious people take great interest in the secret mantra of Vajrayana, but also it's in terms of the culturally and in terms of the philosophy, we can see how this is all very important in the secret mantra of Vajrayana, because we see that in the secret mantra of Vajrayana, there's a combination of many different Indian cultures, the combination of many different histories, not philosophies, not only Buddhism, but also many other ancient Indian philosophies are contained within the secret mantra of Vajrayana. So for that reason, the secret mantra of Vajrayana is like a treasury of ancient Indian culture. It contains many of the essential elements of ancient Indian culture. So normally when we think about it, when we say secret mantra, we think about it in terms of a religious thing, something we consider important out of faith and devotion. But we don't understand the significance, the value that the secret mantra of Vajrayana has in terms of Indian culture. We don't think about it, but it's important for us to keep this in mind. This is like a feature or a quality of the secret mantra of Vajrayana. And so that's basically it. Now, if we were to talk about the early Vedic period, it's probably so it's probably enough for today. And so tomorrow we'll talk about the Vedas and so forth. And there's also quite a lot to speak about the Vedic and the myths and so forth. Now, some of these myths are difficult to speak about it. But there's just no choice but to identify a few of the deities who are spoken about in the Vedic culture, and because they're so important in the secret mantra, and particularly in the secret mantra, we have some of the Vedas deities later became deities in the secret mantra Vajrayana, so they're very important in Indian culture and in secret mantra Vajrayana as well. So tomorrow is a day off, and the day after tomorrow we speak about the Vedas. I will give you an introduction to that subject, but right now, actually, as I said yesterday, I'm someone, I personally haven't studied history, and since I've never studied history, and so I'm thinking, if I kind of say I'm teaching Indian history, it's very difficult when you're just putting yourself in a high position. But there's no choice but to speak about Indian history. And the reason is that if you don't speak about Indian history, then you can't speak about Indian Buddhism history. And if you can't speak about Indian Buddhist history, then you can't speak about the history of secret mantra, which is a part of Buddhism. And so for that reason, I've given a brief history of India, and so then gradually I'll speak about how Buddhism, I'll give you a brief introduction to how Buddhism originated in India, and then how the secret mantra spread. And so these are what I will be introducing. The history of the secret mantra is something it is important for us to take interest in. And the reason for this is that the secret mantra Vajrayana has spread very widely in Tibet, but there are very few who have actually studied the history of the secret mantra Vajrayana. Now, there is some history of the individual tantras, but there's very little about the overall history of the secret mantra Vajrayana. So now, who is it who is researching this? Well, it's primarily the European scholars and also the Japanese scholars. Now, so what they can say whatever they want. Now they can say whatever, they can talk about whatever they want to, but for us Tibetan scholars, we can't even get a seat at the table to discuss that. Since we don't have a seat at the table, we're people who actually studied the secret mantra Vajrayana. We've been practicing the secret mantra for thousands of years. We hold the lineages, but we don't have any right to speak about the secret mantra. If we don't have any right to speak about, or status to speak about the secret mantra Vajrayana, no chair to speak about them, that would be a terrible situation, isn't it? And so for that reason, it's important for us to study the history of the secret mantra Vajrayana and gain a place where we can actually participate in international discussions about the secret mantra Vajrayana. It's a little bit better now than it used to be, but in the past, the way it was that foreign academics didn't really consider secret Vajrayana very highly, and in particular, they didn't consider Tibetan mantrayana very important at all. The reason they said that this is not secret mantra Vajrayana, it's incorrect or wrong. It's not pure Vajrayana, they said. It is incorrect Vajrayana. And when they explain this, we've never heard of this before. We're saying we have just too pure a view and we think we're doing great. But when people look from outside, they say, oh, Tibetan secret mantra mantra isn't good. We've already examined it. We've researched it. That's not good secret mantra. And so they're saying all this, but we haven't opened our eyes. We don't know about it. And so it's important for us to know this. We need to understand this and be able to explain it and be able to give a reply to say we are not incorrect talking about the secret mantra. We have sources and origins for what we do. And in order to give the answer, we need to do the research ourselves. And so we say, if we say the three jewels are true, if whatever we talk about the three jewels or whatever we speak about, it's not going to help at all. So we need to do the research and have reasons and factual response. If we can explain it in that way, then we will be able to get some recognition for it. And so for that reason, it's important for us to take interest in and to learn and study the secret mantra Vajrayana. And particularly among the secret mantra Vajrayana, to say that the Tibetan Vajrayana is actually true and we achieve the recognition that it is a true tradition of Vajrayana. And that is one reason that we need to take interest in this. So now we will recite the dedication prayers.